Laughing Democrats might have called the governor's recent budget address the Bruce Rauner Comedy Hour, but the governor says he's serious. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Hello, I'm Bruce Rushton with Illinois Times, a staff writer. Welcome to Capitol View. Joining us this week is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at University of Illinois Springfield. Welcome, Professor Redfield.
Good to be here.
Great. So much to talk about this week, so much, in fact, that it's just you and I today. All our brethren are out busily combing and scurrying about the Capitol campus, trying to figure out what's going on and who's behind it. So the big news, of course, this week was Governor Bruce Rauner's budget address. It was a speech that lasted, as always, half an hour, 45 minutes or so. Lots of, boy, we can get this done. This is a great time for Illinois. He called us, we're the best at this, and we're the best at that, and we're the best at the other thing. But one thing that was present this week that perhaps that has not been present in past budget addresses is laughter. Democrats openly mocked the governor, laughing at several times during his presentation. What do we make of this? Is this something that they were just giddy about in terms of were they feeling like they had the governor on their heels? I mean, at one point, one of the times it was laughed about was when he talked about, and we can't just go run into the media saying bad things about each other. What do you think about this laughter?
Well, it's indicative of a very toxic atmosphere that's down at the Capitol. In spite of the kind of the goodwill in terms of trying to work the grand bargain through the Senate, there's clearly open warfare between the governor's office and the speaker, and they've really been focusing on the House Democrats. So there's been a constant onslaught of negative publicity and website ads and robocalls and things since the election. And for the governor to then say, you know, kind of give a history of how we got here, primarily pointing at the Democrats, and then to say, but now is not the time to point fingers. I mean, that the Democrats reacted pretty strongly to that. I think another point the governor said that term limits were something that really got potential employers excited about coming to Illinois, and so there was a little bit over the top and a little bit tone deaf. On the other hand, it is extremely unusual to have that level of open hostility and lack of respect in terms of a governor within, in terms of a formal speech, although the General Assembly certainly did not treat Rod Blagojevich very well at times, and rightly so. But this is, this is not, you can get past all this, assuming we get a deal, but it's not helpful.
Oh yeah, I mean, they never put signs on their desks saying fake facts and fake news, which is sorts of signs that some legislators had on their desks as the governor was getting ready to start.
Yeah, it's, decorum has always been a little, looser in the House than it's been in the Senate. And so, we've had some signs on the Republican side of the aisle at times too in the past. But, the substance of the speech, we got some answers, but we didn't get a lot of detail in terms of how we're going to get to where we need to get to.
Yeah, I mean, the governor started out saying for the first time both parties are standing together saying that Illinois must have structural change to grow our economy. Is that true?
Well, there's kind of a, if you think that structural change in terms of a millionaire's tax or a graduated income and workers' comp changes and a property tax freeze, if that's all structural change, then yeah, everybody's got structural change on the table, but they don't have the same things on the table. And so, there's still that fight over what are the business climate kinds of issues that the governor is going to demand to sign something versus kind of, what are we going to do to reconcile a $7 billion gap between expected revenues for the next fiscal year and kind of a maintenance budget going forward. And the governor provided a little bit of direction to go along with what the Senate has been trying to do in terms of bridging that, but there's a long way to go.
Sure, it sounds to me like we might have to define what structural change is. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I think so. And everybody kind of assumes that you're going to have to do something on property taxes and workers' comp. That seemed to be really the governor's bottom line. I don't think that term limits that took effect, in 2018, but really didn't really take effect until somebody 10 years later, are not going to, be a deal breaker in terms of this. And so it really gets down to, can you agree on a workers' comp that you can put 30 and 60 on? Can you agree on property tax you can put 30 and 60 on? But then that gets you to, can you agree on a budget that reconciles revenue with expenditures by increasing revenue and cutting expenditures? So there are really, they're very, very difficult tasks there. And even if you just kind of get by the workers' comp and pension reform has to be part of that. Pension reform, it's also a budget issue, but it's also kind of a philosophical issue. But then you still have to solve the math, to make the math work. And the governor's budget, quite frankly, it gets from reconciles revenue and expenditures by making more than $2 billion worth of cuts, some of which would require the General Assembly to vote on them, and we can talk about them. But then there's about $4.5 billion sitting out there.
Excuse me, million or billion?
Billion.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. $4.5 billion sitting out there that is kind of working towards the grand bargain. So is that $4 billion worth of revenue? Is it $4 billion worth of cuts? Is it a mixture? And so it's a long, long way to go.
So let's first off, let's figure out what we have solved here, at least in a philosophical sense. I think you're probably right. The workman's comp, there's a pretty widespread agreement that we can, they're willing the Democrats are willing to move on that. There's a good case that could be made for some reform there. So I think that's probably, I agree with you, that's probably there to be worked on where there's some hope. Property tax, it's hard to argue when Illinois has demonstrably the highest median property taxes in the entire country. That's probably an easy sell for the governor to say we need to cap it. The question would presumably be, okay, if we cap it, where do we make up for it? Is that a fair statement? Or?
Yeah, and it depends on what the freeze looks like. Is it temporary? Is it permanent? Are we talking about how much you're extending? Are we talking about freezing rates? Property taxes have got a lot of moving parts that get you to what shows up in your tax bill, and so how do you allow for growth? If a community doubles in size with economic growth, how do you, and you've got increased value of property, how do you figure all of those things in there? I mean, it is complicated, and right now there's a conflict between the Senate kind of agreeing to a property tax freeze and the governor wanting a permanent a temporary property tax freeze as opposed to the governor wanting a permanent property tax freeze. But it's, I think everybody assumes we're going to have to do something with property taxes to get out of this mess.
Okay. So we got $7 billion, give or take, that we need to figure out. Is that about the right?
Yeah, I mean nobody knows for sure what revenues are going to look like. But that's a reasonable ballpark.
Sure. Okay. So if we jack the income tax up to, we don't want to put to 5 because then that would mean that it went back to where it was during the 2014 election. I think probably Rauner doesn't want to do that. So we've been talking. There's been talk of 4.95. There's been talk about 4.99 from the current rate of 3.75. Any sense as to how well that's going to go, and if that did go, does that tax our way out of this problem?
Well, it does not get you there. Okay. The Civic Federation, well-regarded watchdog group in Chicago, they've got a budget out there, an analysis that's got some pretty significant cuts, and getting the income tax up above 5 and the corporate back up about 7 and saying, if we do this and this and this, so it's, the rate is important. 5% seems to be, kind of the third. Yeah, we always have a third rail in Illinois politics, but then we can do base. Can we get rid of some tax expenditures to business credits? Can we tax retirement? Probably not. The governor said no.
Yeah, and that was, not to interrupt here, but that was one of the things that he did seem to say, cut and dry, categorical, no way, no how, that's off the table. How big of a thing is that? Because one thing, I think that a lot of folks who've looked into this can agree on, that when you say this would tax poor folks out of their homes, that's somewhat of a misnomer, given that most of the proposals we've seen, in fact, all of the ones that I've seen, would exempt entirely the first $50,000 in retirement income. So if you made $50,000 in retirement income, you'd pay no income tax. And if you made $55,000 in retirement income, you'd pay income tax only on the first $5,000. So, but that seems to be completely gone. And how big of a thing is that? How much pressure does that create, if at all?
Well, if you put it in there, depending on, it's $1 to $2 billion, depending on how much of it you tax. But that's very unpopular. The groups that would be against it, in addition to state employees, because you're also talking about kind of all retirement income rather than Social Security, groups like the AARP, who are very effective and have very effective communication.
Because old people vote.
Yes, and they've got a very good network. So, that's always been a tough sell. So, the income tax, you can get the base a little bigger. The next option is the sales tax, because if you look at the General Revenue Fund, the two biggest sources of money are income tax and sales tax. And so the sales tax, the talk is, can we open up the base? Now, there was discussion, it's not in any of the bills, putting food and drugs back in the sales tax.
The governor says no, not going to do food and drugs.
No. But if we put services in there, which all the states around us have a certain degree of services, and it makes sense. I mean, we're basically operating in terms of income tax, with a flat tax and with a sales tax basically on business on the selling of things rather than services. We've got a 1960s or 70s kind of tax structure within a 2018 business economy.
Sure,
yeah, we've gone from 30% of the economy to 50% of the economy involving services. So we're not taxing economic activity or economic growth. So that's certainly a way to get some revenue. And I think that's probably what you're going to see on the revenue side, are going to be an increase in the rate of the income tax, and maybe a little tinkering with the base on some business credits or tax expenditures. I mean, I get money off my income tax because I own a house and pay property tax. Does nothing, it applies no pressure to any of the taxing bodies that I pay property taxes to. It's just something the state gives me. And you could argue that, maybe that if, that would be a place where you could redirect that money. It's not a, but at any rate, you do income tax, you do sales tax. Now, the other thing that's hanging out there in terms of the base on the sales tax is the tax on sugary drugs.
Sugary beverages, sorry.
Sugary beverages, not sugary drugs.
Well, we like sugary drugs too.
All right, yes, sugary beverages. And that's, those are well-organized lobbies.
Sure.
The governor makes the point that, kind of indirectly, that we should be listening to the people rather than the lobbyists, and that's actually something that there's some good polling that says that's something the public is, you probably have a majority of the public that thinks that we ought to be healthier.
Sure.
It's,
I mean, big soda is becoming like big tobacco now, almost. Yeah.
So we can do some things on the revenue side.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, who knows? I mean, what you seem to be saying is we seem to be headed in a general direction that, quite frankly, seems somewhat obvious all along. I mean, if you've got the largest sector of your economy that's services being untaxed, why has it taken us 2 years to say, hey, maybe we should tax services?
Well, because we started off on the wrong foot with the governor going for a 42-point agenda.
Turnaround agenda. He's turned around a bit.
And putting right to work out on, right at the front of that, going out and campaigning on right to work, and that really poisoned the atmosphere, and it brought the trade unions and the service unions in with the public employee unions, unified big labor, and so we've had this standoff game, and that devolved into a game of chicken. Okay. And we can't overstate how big a trouble we're in.
Okay.
I mean, it's always good to say, quickly that we have the lowest bond rating of any state in the nation on all three rating services, and we are $14 billion of unpaid bills, and if we just do what we've been doing, next year we have $21 billion of unpaid bills. You do it for 2 more years, you've got $35 billion of unpaid bills and $32 billion of revenue. It's not sustainable.
Yes, that's $11 million a day for interest and various costs just on the stuff we're not paying for. Right. So $11 million a day. That adds up to billions pretty quickly. One thing I'm wondering about is that when we talk about just food and medicine, no, we're not going to do that. Now that we're talking about services, is it possible politically, if not economically, to broaden the sales tax to include enough services that the state could go from, 6.5 now, and lower the percentage of it so that you spread the tax base off. It provides more stability, reliability. If one sector of the economy goes down, you got other sectors that are still there to keep you afloat. Is that something you think might have any wheels in the legislature?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to sell it, is to say that your rate is going down and the base is going to be broadened, and we're going to generate more money. So I think the revenue side, there's some, I think that's doable. The cut side of it, now we get into priorities. What's important? Higher ed, elementary and secondary ed, which social services are important, because you can't, the governor is right, you can't tax your way out.
Correct.
Of course you all of us can. We could tax it, raise it to 10%. We could make $7 billion worth of cuts, like the Illinois Policy Institute's budget does, and basically decimate local government in terms of its ability to raise revenue. So you can always at the extreme, but you're going to have to get something in the middle, and when you get to cuts, then it's about what particular program, which particular agency, and so we've got cuts to higher ed, and we've got cost shifts to higher ed with the governor's Tier 3 pension, and so we're starting. Now we get down to who gets the money. Sure. Do we continue to give money to elementary and secondary and early childhood and cut everybody else? Or how do we start to pick up the other things? So crafting a budget with $3 billion worth of cuts, if it's $3 billion worth of revenue, or 3.5 and 3.5, that's very difficult.
What about health insurance? Because that's one of the things that's going to be a major thing that the governor wants to do to try to reduce costs, is to cut the amount that the state spends for health insurance for its employees. This is coming at a time when the state and the state's largest union are at loggerheads on a contract negotiation. There's ongoing litigation that could affect that. On one level, it sounds good to folks that don't work for the state. Why should I have to pay what I pay for health insurance when state employees get a Cadillac plan for practically nothing? That's what the governor said in his budget address. Is that going to go anywhere?
Yeah, I think that the governor has the upper hand because he has an impasse and he can impose his contract, and if he imposes that contract on AFSCME, that's going to involve significant changes in health care. You're going to more out of pocket for the retiree, and for the employee and the retiree, and increased premiums. There's no, the costs are going to go up, and they're looking for, at least $500 million, maybe more, worth out of savings in health care. And if you're going to cut, those are the big items: employee health care, employee salaries, pensions. Those are some real drivers in terms of this. And so I think that it is, I mean, everybody that's a new employee is Tier 2. They're now going to end up paying higher health care premiums and more higher co-pays. So we're going to have a significant reduction in kind of what it looks like to work for the state. Now, whether that's bringing things into balance or balancing the budget on the back of state employees is a matter of perspective.
Sure.
But there's no question, I think, that you're going to, the state workers are going to end up, bearing, if we get to a balanced budget, part of it is certainly going to be borne, or a significant part is going to be borne more by them.
And the union has already said, hey, we'll go without raises or with virtually no raises. It seems to them that what they're trying to protect is their health insurance. And so the money part of it doesn't seem, at least by way of salaries, doesn't seem nearly as important as the health part.
Right, and if you look at what's been happening, wages have been relatively flat.
Right.
And healthcare costs, although we've slowed down the rate of increase, they have gone through the roof. And the thing that is, the biggest problem for units of local government for the state is employee healthcare costs. I mean,
Sure.
that's the biggest driver of increases. And so, if we're going to slow down state spending to below the rate of inflation, which is a pretty tough thing to do, it's hard to see how you do that without significant increases, decreases in the state's spending on health care.
Sure. Well, speaking of state employees, this just in from St. Clair County, a move it lost, which is very rare apparently, at least St. Clair County has that reputation as being very anti-defended. However, in this case, Lisa Madigan has, at least in the first round, apparently lost her bid to install a fast deadline of February 28th to either get past the state budget or to stop paying employees. How does this weigh in at all? I mean, what is this an X factor that's no longer a factor at all anymore?
Well, this was always going to be appealed, regardless of whether the restraining order was lifted or not. And what you're talking about now is, you'll go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court passed back in 2015 on taking it up, and then everybody just left it alone rather than go through the trial court, the appellate court. Now, does the state Supreme Court have a stronger appetite to take this up, particularly in light of a couple of decisions that indicate that if it comes in front of them and you read the plain language of the Constitution, they've already ruled that you can't spend money without an appropriation, which is what we're doing.
Yeah, it's kind of like a dark closet that nobody really wants to look inside, and so...
And the courts always would rather things like this get handled politically. They are the third branch. There is a separation of power. They interpret the Constitution. And, they would have preferred the state took care of its own business on pensions rather than to declare the pension fix unconstitutional. But, when it got...
It was an easy call when they did.
Yeah, when they got there, they did that. And so, it doesn't add a lot of clarity. It may really... People may feel some of the pressure is off, but it could come back on very quickly.
If you're Lisa Madigan, what do you do? Do you appeal immediately? I mean, what's the yin and yang of that?
Yeah, I think you're already committed to doing that. I mean, she's taken a position that, I waited, it was prudent, I thought that this would get resolved, but now that it hasn't, we need a hard deadline. So I think she's committed. Okay.
Moving along to something completely different, but not completely different. This was contained in the governor's budget released. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum here in Springfield would become a standalone agency under the governor's budget. Historic sites would be folded to the Department of Natural Resources, and the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency would cease to exist. This is not an idea that is brand new. In 2014, the Speaker of the House recommended something similar, that the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum would become a standalone institution. IHPA would continue to exist. Under Rauner, that morphed into, okay, it will be the Presidential Library Museum would be a standalone, but the other functions of the IHPA would be folded to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. What are we to make of this? I mean, where did this come from, and what potential does it have, do you think, to become reality?
Well, this will be done, I assume, under the governor's reorganization power, which sit in the Constitution. That gives a governor's wide leeway in terms of restructuring state government. And so if you do it that way, then essentially, the legislature then has to affirmatively disapprove of it. And, you're essentially rewriting statutes. And so if it becomes a standing alone agency, it might still retain a governing board that appoints a director. It might be an agency that the governor appoints the director. So it could mean a lot more independence for the director of the agency. And it certainly, sets the agency out there as, a focus of attention. And whether that's the best way to handle historic preservation in terms of the state library, Dixon Mounds. I mean, there's a bunch of other things that are going to natural resources. And so, there's some management issues, but as always in Illinois, there's some politics there in terms in terms of who gets appointed and who's having the say. I mean, in this case at least, we've got at least some sort of past history that indicates that both the Senate and the House would be amenable to that sort of an idea of making it a standalone, but perhaps the devil's in the details. Yeah, this doesn't seem to be something that is going to be a major concern to most people. They like the library to be open. They want it to be well run.
But with that, we're out of time, and I appreciate you coming here, Professor Redfield, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.